Game over, man. Game over. Johnny.
You're gonna need a bigger boat. Why so serious?
I am Iron Man.
This is a tasty burger.
Welcome to the InSession Film Podcast.
Welcome to episode 548 for August 21st, 2023. And I'm JD Duran.
And I'm Brennan Cassidy.
Hey, thanks for joining us this week, everybody. If my voice sounds different than it usually is, if that's something you're noticing, you're not crazy. You're correct in that. And I don't know what it is.
You're even less crazy if you notice it on my side, too.
Yeah. I am not sick. I feel fine. I worked out earlier. Everything's great. I feel wonderful. My voice is just disappearing.
It's the battle. It's the battle of the diminishing voices. Is basically what this is. That's what this episode is all about.
Absolutely. So we're kicking through all of this, though. We're gonna have a lot of fun on this week's show.
Yeah.
If you haven't had a chance to listen to our Blue Beetle review, please go and check that out. We were finally joined by the great Rosa Parra.
Yeah.
She joined me to talk about that film, and man, we had a lot of great things to say. It was fun to hear her enthusiasm for that movie.
For sure.
And it's certainly going to be the inspiration for this week's show. I do want to talk about its box office here in a moment, because it is a theme of the summer with everything going on.
I know. We always open up with box office, but this time we're not talking Barbenheimer.
We're not talking Barbenheimer for once. We'll get to that here in a second. But also, I'm really excited for what will end up being our featured conversation here.
Yeah.
Because when I walked out of Blue Beetle, and for those that did not listen to that review yet, please go and check it out again. It was really fun.
Yeah.
I do want to note this, though. I went to see it with my son Sam at the press screening here in Miami.
Okay.
And I am not exaggerating when I say that we were one of a handful, probably less than 5, that was not Hispanic at this screening.
Wow.
And it was a pretty full screening. And it was exciting to see the passion for it. Everyone was very exciting. And I love that they didn't really pander to us. Like, they had like these pre-movie festivities. They had a DJ there. There was a lot of dancing. It really set the mood and the tone very well. And everything was done in Spanish. When someone was talking to the audience, it was all done in Spanish. And we had no idea what they were saying, but we were having a good time. Sam was up and cheering and applauding as everyone else was.
That's amazing, yeah, especially with your young one there watching all this from the mindset of a second grader, because he just started second grade, right?
He just started second grade as of the day we are recording this. So
Wow.
yeah, big day for him with that. For
wow.
sure.
How are you not crying right now?
Well, I did all of that this morning. So I got that out of my system.
Okay, so no wonder your voice is gone. You're dried up.
part
That's
of it.
what's happening. You're dehydrated.
At any rate, we went to this. It was a great time. And as you'll hear in our conversation, as I talk about this a little bit further, it was really fun to hear the crowd and them react to the very specific Hispanic things that are in that movie, like the references and the jokes that went way over my head. I had no idea what they were talking about, but everyone else did. And it just made for a really fun experience.
Sure.
And so I walked out of that movie on a high. I felt really great about it. I thought it was a lot of fun.
Good.
And I say that while also recognizing that it's a superhero movie following the origin story formula. You know, the tropes are all there. So yes, it is a movie that you could criticize for being derivative, but I think that in execution, it was really quite good. And so my initial thought was Roger Ebert.
Yep.
One of the quotes of his that we hold to very closely is his quote of, "It's not what a movie's about, it's how it's about."
Yep.
I think that is so applicable to something like Blue Beetle. I don't like criticizing that movie for its tropes is a hollow talking point.
That's just such a mundane criticism nowadays. Whether the movie really earns that criticism or not, I feel like it's just such an easy target regardless.
It is, because in execution, I think that there is so much fun to be had. It's Hispanic references and the way it embraces its culture is so meaningful, as Rosa was talking about in our conversation, as you've seen with a lot of Hispanic critics talk about.
Yeah.
It does mean something to them. And the crowd in the theater that I went with, which, again, primarily a Hispanic crowd, you can't tell me that it didn't mean something to them. It did.
Yeah.
It meant a lot to them. So I think there is something to be said about its execution. And that will be the root of our conversation here, as we're going to talk about some of our favorite movies that best exemplify that idea of it's not what it's about, it's how it's about.
Yep.
And
we've been saying this many times on the show. It's finally time we dedicate a full episode to that great quote from the great Roger Ebert, who I mean, we hold a critic like that in such high regard. Everyone who works in the industry holds that critic in such high regard. And to be honest, I don't quite remember when it was when he said this quote. For those of you listening, if you know this, please let us know, because I can't quite remember exactly when in his life he said this, but it's always something that he held true to himself. Like whenever he talked about movies, you could sense this ideology in the way he talked about anything. And we'll get more into maybe some of those examples of Ebert's own history with certain movies that he may have disliked that are now regarded as classics because he felt this same thing applying to that. And I think that's so interesting. But yeah, we always tend to hold this ideology on a very high pedestal when we look to modern movies nowadays.
Absolutely. So with that laid out, we'll get to that here shortly. I do want to start the show here by talking about Blue Beetle and its box office, because it was reported that it only grossed $25 million domestically, which is a low for the DCU/DCEU, coming in even lower than Black Adam, which is unfortunate. Worldwide, it's not a whole lot better. It's only at $43.5 million at this point, which is really unfortunate because, like I noted, at least with my audience, I think this is indicative of what we've seen online as well across the board. Those that did go see it anyway have really liked it. And I hope that, like, my biggest hope here is that it has an Elemental type run. I mean, that. Oh,
I've been hearing a lot of people say narrative. That it could word of mouth carry this one like it did with Elemental.
I mean, because Elemental was also dug a grave and left out in the desert on its own.
Well,
people left that for dead.
Let's look at the comparisons, right? Both movies arguably didn't have the best marketing campaigns to support them. I felt the same way about Blue Beetle. I felt like we had maybe 2 trailers that were barely even really pushed. I never really noticed many TV spots or any other form of viral marketing or just online digital marketing. So they have similar, I guess, lack of strategies, if you want to say that. And that is unfortunate. But Elemental, when that first came out, we already saw headlines saying this movie is a bomb for Pixar. It's a bomb. And
29.6 million was its opening domestically, which is not a whole lot higher than what we just saw.
No, especially for an expensive animated movie like a Pixar movie.
Yes.
And look what happened. Look what happened to Elemental. A couple weeks went by and people started thinking, wait a minute, this might have some legs. Did we speak a little bit too soon here?
Yeah, absolutely. And right now, a couple of months later, because it came out on June 16th, it is now August 21st. As of right now, it has grossed $151 million domestically and $458 million worldwide.
See, there you go. That's a little bit. That's a little bit more than 29, right?
That's a little bit more than 29. I mean, that's incredible. I mean, that is a really great slow burn, maybe pun intended.
Nice.
And I do think there's some interesting comparisons with that film and Blue Beetle. I mean, Elemental is an allegory for immigration, And I think
Fair.
there's something to be related there with the Hispanic community. And in some ways, it's also a part of what we see in Blue Beetle. And the familial component, I think there's some incredible similarities with both of those films. So
Just
I do
tell
hope
timeless stories about family, and you've got a hit on
Yeah.
your hands. It just might take a while to get there.
it might take a while to get there. And you're right that the marketing for Blue Beetle wasn't very good to begin with. And then the Hollywood strikes happen.
Yeah.
And now the cast cannot go out there and promote the
That's
movie.
a huge part of it, unfortunately.
that-
You're right.
There's no doubt that's been a hindrance on this. In fact, I believe there was a report over the weekend where studios even admitted, and I can't remember the exact percentage, but something to the effect of that they think their movies are taking like a 15-25% hit on the actors not promoting their movies, which is hilarious irony.
I mean, literally, the majority of word of mouth for a lot of upcoming movies gets spread on, let's say, like morning talk shows, for instance, when actors are there promoting their upcoming
late night.
Yeah, late
that
night.
sort
I
of
mean, it's not
stuff.
just morning talk
Yeah.
shows. I only reference that as an example because
For
sometimes
sure.
we have it on in the
There's
background while I'm
various
working my
kinds.
9 to 5.
Yep.
But that's a huge part of it. So if the estimation is 15 to 25% of a box office dip because of that, I don't think that's hyperbole. I think that is entirely possible. I don't know the math or the figures, but I would not be surprised if it were the case.
And it goes to show that, at least for the stars, the actors' roles for these movies do not end when the director says cut and we're done with this movie.
No.
When it's time to release it, they have to go out and promote it. That is part of their job.
So the moral is pay them. Don't replace them with AI.
Pay them what they're worth. If you're admitting that these actors not going out and promoting movie is costing you at least an additional 20%, what are we doing here?
Yeah.
You're admitting that up front. Like, it blows my mind. And you're still like, nah, never mind. We're not going to pay them. It truly astounds the mind. But,
Oh my gosh.
with all of that said,
My brain is soup right now.
it is unfortunate, but I do hope that it does have some word of mouth, because I do think it is really fun. It's also the end of summer, and as we somewhat joked about earlier, a lot of families are getting ready to go back to school. So it perhaps just didn't come out at a great time. But if you look at what's coming up in September, there's not really a lot that's coming out that screams, oh my gosh, I have to go see this in theaters.
Yeah.
I don't think it's going to have a ton of competition. There's the Gran Turismo movie that's coming out. That will certainly offer up some competition.
Yeah.
But when you get into September, there are a few titles for sure, especially on the smaller side of things. But when it comes to big, wide releases, I don't really see anything there that would be a huge dagger to something like Blue Beetle if it does end up having an elemental type run. Like, it really is something where word of mouth could carry this at least for another month and a half.
Yeah.
And that 25 million could rise up to, I don't know, 100 million.
I mean, if anything hurts it, maybe people will just keep going to see Barbie and Oppenheimer again.
Well, there is that.
Yeah.
I think that is certainly the case, because
I swear, when I went to see when I went to the movies the other day to see Talk to Me before we did that review, my gosh, the entire theater lobby was just filled with people in pink. This was maybe,
you still see it a lot.
This was maybe a 2 p.m. screening on a Sunday or something like that.
Yeah, Barbie obviously over $1 billion. Oppenheimer, I think, just crossed the 700 million mark.
Yeah. Yeah.
And just passed Interstellar in terms of Nolan's career.
It passed another record too. I forget what it was. Isn't it in the top 5 of highest grossing 3-hour biopics or something like that?
It has to be.
It was very weird and specific statistic that was released that it's now holding in a top 5 status. I forget exactly what it was, but it's hard to see that happening
crazy.
for a movie like that.
I thought it was really funny when that Logan Paul tweet dropped this last week, and everyone lost their minds because he was talking about how it was boring. It was just men talking for 3 hours and that he left early. The funny thing about that to me is, well, I don't think that it's boring, but the whole idea that it's just people talking for 3 hours, that's not necessarily incorrect. And it's incredible that film made $700 million.
Didn't he also say that he walked
Insane.
out at the 18-minute mark or something?
Yeah, like his thoughts on movies are invalid. Let's just clear the air.
Sadly, he has an audience.
I know. It's ridiculous.
Gosh, like I'm not a violent person, but people like that I want to punch in the
That
face.
does make the blood boil a little bit.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah, I do agree there. But look, that idea is very true. You go and see Oppenheimer, and yes, Nolan makes it extremely compelling. It's obviously extremely simplified to say that it's just people talking for 3 hours, but in a lot of ways it is. But Nolan makes that so engrossing and cinematic that I can see why people would go and see this multiple times in theaters. I've seen it twice.
Yeah.
I would love to go see it for a third time if I could find the time.
Again, it's not what it's about. It's how it's about.
It's how it's about.
See?
Exactly. It's a great point, Brendan. It's not that it's just 3 hours of people talking in rooms. That's what it's about. It's how no one goes about doing that. That is incredible.
So
And,
clearly, we
yeah.
picked the right topic for this weekend.
We certainly did. All of that to say, I hope Blue Beetle goes on an elemental type run. That's kind of the moral of the story here. But yeah, the Barbenheimer thing just continues to just be this historical monster. And I'm curious how far Oppenheimer goes. Could it somehow get to $1 billion in the next
It'll be a
few months?
fist in the air moment for all
could you
critics
imagine?
out there.
Could you imagine?
Incredible.
And look,
Oppenheimer as $1 billion movie.
it only has 300 million more to go. And look, that's a lot.
Yeah.
I understand that's a lot. But I don't think it's impossible to say that it might get there in a few more months. By the end
I
of the
will
year,
say
maybe.
this. I'll be ecstatic. I'll be happy. I don't know if I'll be too surprised if it makes it to $1 billion. I mean, I'll be somewhat surprised just given the fact that a movie like Oppenheimer is now $1 billion movie, because I don't think people really expected that when it first came out, let alone being announced way back when. But I'm at a point now, just given the trajectory of it, and thanks to the assistance of Barbie, I could see that happening. I could see it happening.
I mean, it's pretty wild. I mean, I was looking at some of the 70 millimeter IMAX screenings in the area. Now, I went to see it in 70 millimeter. It was the weekend right after my birthday, like that Friday. So, like, I don't know, the 11th or whatever it was.
And
However,
you saw it in IMAX before that, but it wasn't 70
Yes,
millimeter,
and I had
right?
seen it in IMAX before, but it wasn't 70 millimeter.
Okay.
I just went to the first showing I possibly could because I was getting back from vacation. And I just wanted to go see it as soon as possible. But then I went a second time, saw it in 70 millimeter. And I haven't even really spoken to that. I mean, just astounding. Like, that whole experience was just remarkable.
I have no excuse because I live within 10 to 15 minutes of the Regal in King of Prussia, which has a 70 millimeter theater playing it.
Yeah.
So I have no excuse. I could take an
Uber
Uber to it and be there in 10
You
minutes.
definitely got to make time. It's absolutely worth it. But, I say all that to say I was looking at one of the IMAX 70 millimeter that's playing in the area.
Sure.
And this was, before I went to see it. And so like August 7th-ish, the next available screening that had anything open at all was August 26th, which we haven't even reached yet. So every Oppenheimer 70 millimeter showing over the last 3 weeks has been sold out for a long time.
Isn't that incredible?
It's
And I'm,
just
you know,
wild.
as we're talking, I'm looking at the Regal United Artists King of Prussia that I live very close to,
Mhm.
and I'm looking at the movie times here, and I went all the way until this upcoming weekend, so almost a week from when we're recording this. There are 4 IMAX 70 millimeter screenings playing on just Friday and Saturday alone. So
Okay, yeah.
it's still kicking. It
It's
is still
still
kicking.
kicking, man. People are going to see it and Barbie. I mean, at this rate, I don't know what other contenders there are for award
Best Picture
season.
and Best Director.
Like, I mean, goodness great, especially if Oppenheimer reaches $1 billion. You have 2 summer hits that aren't your typical summer blockbuster fare that get
Yeah.
to $1 billion.
And that's
I
the
mean,
thing.
the conversation's over.
It's not like Top Gun Maverick. I mean, it sort of is, but it also isn't. But that, that was a blockbuster. That was billed as a blockbuster. It was an event for those reasons. But this is a little different, especially with Oppenheimer. This is a very different type of contender you're dealing with.
Yeah, Barbie was always going to be a film that people were interested in. It was probably going to be a success.
Yeah.
But it wasn't billed as this Avengers level event.
Right. Right.
But and neither was Oppenheimer. It was a Nolan film for sure. But and we've talked about this. It was the Barbenheimer thing of it all. That's what made it an event.
I like how we
but-
said we weren't going to talk about Barbenheimer, and here
and
we
then
are.
Here we are. Yeah, just see.
Every time we
without-
think we get out,
anyway.
they pull us back in.
They pull us back in. Anyway, all of that to say, I liked Blue Beetle. I hope people go and see it. And I hope it goes on an elemental type run. Okay. Well, for real transition this time.
Yeah.
And we're gonna talk about movies that best exemplify. It's not what it's about, it's how it's about. And as we talked about, it's the ethos of that is the DNA of every single one of our reviews.
Yeah.
And I think it is one of the most important things when it comes to film criticism, because calling out a film for being what it's about, like if the conversation starts there, you've already lost me. Like I can't really come around and have a conversation about how derivative it is or how trite or how formulaic a film is.
Yeah.
We can have that conversation for a lot of movies.
Yeah.
And that doesn't describe anything. Like that doesn't say anything. Like tell me how it went about doing those things, and now we can have a conversation.
And that's where I think the distinction is, right? Because you and I have sometimes I feel like we've never really criticized a movie for its formula, but we have acknowledged that the formula becomes more apparent, maybe in a negative way, if the surrounding attributes don't work to support it, right? But that that gets more into the how, right? That gets more into the storytelling tropes, whatever that filmmaker or whatever that movie is doing in utilizing those familiar tropes that it fails. And there will be some examples that I at least talk about that were sort of that we've acknowledged before, certain formulas from certain types of movies. But sometimes we've acknowledged that we recognize the formula, and sometimes we can see the formula.
Yeah.
But that means maybe those surrounding hows are not quite successful then.
Yeah, absolutely. And because if you go back and listen to the archive, you've absolutely heard me criticize movies for being derivative or for being trite. But in every one of those instances, it was always about its execution, its narrative construction, its use of those tropes, its lack of character or emotion, its pacing and rhythm, how its ideas are deployed. It all came down to not what it's about, but how the film is using those things.
Yeah.
And in execution, if it becomes trite, then that's how I will talk about it.
Right.
And if I called the film that's what I'm talking about. I'm not talking about its formula or again, what it's trying to do. I want to talk about its execution.
Yeah.
And so with that said, let's talk about some specific examples.
Okay.
I was recently on my sister's podcast. I don't know when it's coming out, but She has a podcast called Healing in the Waves. And it's this podcast that, as you may guess, it's all about healing and coping with trauma in our lives. And I was on to talk about movies about healing. One of those movies that I talked about, I think, is a great example of this. That is 2011's Warrior. Talk about a movie that on paper, it follows a very familiar formula as it relates to sports movies or boxing movies, fighting movies. There's nothing new about that film from a writing perspective, at least from a plotting perspective, that makes you go, you know what? This film might win an Oscar for writing.
This was very inventive. Yeah.
Like, no, that's not what makes that film so engrossing. It's how Gavin O'Connor and those actors, and you talk about extremely affecting performances, and a movie that could have easily have been something that today would be thrown on Netflix or Hulu, and who gives a crap about this movie? It could have been just a paid gig. You get in, you get out, and that's it. And you talk about bad marketing. That's exactly what the marketing seemed to suggest.
Yeah, for sure.
Because the trailers were not very good. There was nothing about the marketing that was appealing. But you watch this film in execution, and all of those tropes that make up a sports movie or a boxing movie or a fighting movie that makes, again, the A to Z feel familiar, all of that is on the back burner. It's like the last thing this film cares about. It is all about its drama, its emotion, that idea of recovery and alcoholism and fighting for your family. How the film does that in execution, if you're not emotionally moved and maybe overtly bawling at the end of this film like I was, you need to check your pulse. You might be dead. Because this film is extremely moving. It is so, and so to me, that is one of the quintessential movies within this topic, because it's not reinventing the wheel. But in execution, it's as strong as anything that came out that year.
It's all about sincerity. We talk about that word a lot too, right? And a movie can be derivative just simply on the page, but it can be delivered in such a sincere way that it almost doesn't matter. And in the case of Warrior, it really does come down to the performances, right? I mean, you talk about the ending being as powerful as it is, but I think about the many quieter scenes involving Nick Nolte. There's that one confrontation he has at the what is it, at the casino or something like that, and just his facial reaction without saying a darn thing for the most part. It's moments like that are able to, I mean, I hate using this word, but I have to use it here because it's the only appropriate one. It elevates the material, right? It really does. It does.
You're not wrong.
Yeah, and you know me, I usually hate using that word, but in some cases, it's accurate. I think it's accurate in the case of what we're talking about here, because these performances, especially in Warrior, really take advantage of what this story should have been without it ever divulging into what it could have been, and that's what I love about it.
I agree. Or you think about that moment near the end when Brennan is telling Tommy just to tap out. And again, it's not even just the performances there, because the performances are engrossing. Joel Edgerton is great. Tom Hardy is fantastic. But you think of Gavin O'Connor's direction, the music and how it swells, that song and how it helps evoke or amplify that emotion there is incredible. The ambiguity as the brothers just simply walk out, giving you this feeling that there's hope and redemption now at play for these brothers. Yeah. Like, that to me is just elite filmmaking at its best. Yeah. And again, when the studios greenlit this, I don't think they had this in mind at all. No. Whatever executive said, yeah, this sounds good. They wanted a knockoff Rocky. That's what they wanted. Yeah. And what they got was something way more than that. And to me, I think it's one of the best movies of that year. And it all came down to execution.
I'm glad you're starting this conversation off with Warrior, because when we talk about this concept of it's not what it's about, it's how it's about, you can lump so many sports movies into this category.
Yeah,
You really
sports
can.
movies is a big one for sure.
Yeah, we could probably dedicate the entire conversation to sports movies,
You know,
right?
Mystery Alaska is another one for me.
Well, yeah.
Like I really like that movie a lot, and in some ways it bucks the trend a little bit, especially of the time, because in the 90s it was more of the Remember the Titans thing or the Mighty Ducks, and you know this was a little bit like it ends in a way that is more Rocky-ish than it is sports movies of the 90s.
Yeah.
But on the whole, it does follow a familiar sports beat for sure.
Well, and I'm glad you bring up Warrior specifically, because sometimes I feel like we recognize this formula even more clearly in movies about fighting, especially boxing.
Yeah.
Right. Which is why one of the films I wanted to talk about here is, you mentioned Rocky, right? Because Rocky in some ways it almost like created the formula in some ways, at least in that sports world. Which is why I think
it have Rocky.
Yeah, for sure.
Oh, a bunch to Rocky. Yeah.
They owe a lot to it, but I think one of the movies that did the best job wearing the Rocky formula on its sleeve and really doing something great with it was Creed. It was Ryan Coogler's Creed. And you know, we don't have to spend too much time on it because it works for a lot of the same reasons you already talked about with Warrior, right? But that's a movie that is literally the Rocky formula, but it uses it as a thematic idea of overarching legacy and what it means to either embrace it or overcome it into your own idea. So the film kind of takes that formula and actually utilizes it in a very interesting way. Even Creed 2, arguably a very formulaic, it might even be the most quote unquote formulaic of the three, if you think about it, of the three Creed films specifically. And sometimes I think it's the best one.
I love it. Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah.
Ironically, of the three Creed films, the one that veers the most away from its respective formula is my least favorite of the three, and that is Creed 3. It's still a good movie, still a fine movie.
I liked it.
But you could certainly say it's the most unpredictable of the three, if that makes sense. Maybe not unpredictable, but it's the one that sheds the formula away a little bit more. It tries to really embrace its own thing and create its own narrative intrigue. But at the same time, I don't think it's as emotionally powerful as the other two, which again, take that formula, you more or less know where the movie is going to go, and I still find those movies devastating. So it works in the same way that Warrior does that you brought up earlier.
Absolutely. I very much do agree with that. Creed is another one I thought of in addition to Warrior and Mystery Alaska, you know, or Remember the Titans. Friday Night Lights, you know, I just saw this just came to mind earlier today because good friend of the show, Eric Anderson, watched it the other night, put out a little tweet about it, that it's his favorite sports movie. And I was like, yeah, that's a good one for this list. Like, I really like that. It is, yeah. Now, again, similarly to Mystery Alaska, it somewhat bucks the trend at the end. Yeah. But you look at its sports tropes throughout a lot of that movie, and it does adhere to the formula in a lot of ways. But in execution, I love its gritty emotion that you see throughout a lot of that film, and it is raw. It's a raw movie emotionally.
There's something very visceral and domestic about that movie.
Yes,
where it almost seems like the sports angle is kind of secondary.
Yeah,
to just like this very rural Texas life, right?
Yes.
Like that, and that's an example of a movie elevating the formula that's on the page. But you're right. There is a moment from a narrative script telling standpoint where Friday Night Lights kind of bucks the trend at least a little bit, which is why I did think about it for this list. But I think it kind of veers slightly away from the concept here because it does have a slight sense of unpredictability by the end.
Yeah, and that's fair.
Yeah, which is another reason why another sports movie I almost considered here was something like Clint Eastwood's $1 Million Baby. But I think that's one that really bucks the trend by that third act. It very deliberately does. But leading up to that, it still more or less follows the trend a little.
Yeah, and I thought of Friday Night Lights and Mystery Alaska as far as, or at least I question whether they do belong here because the ending certainly is a little subversive. However, if you want to call it derivative, I think that is somewhat fair because of Rocky, of something like Rocky, which set
Right.
a precedent for sports movies and how they don't have to always end the same way. And both of those movies have Rocky-esque endings that aren't about the sport and who wins or loses, but the characters and where they are by the end of the movie. Like why that's most important. And those two movies, I think, qualify in that regard. So if you want to call it, derivative or trite because of how it follows the Rocky formula, fine, then I'll throw them in here because in both cases, I think they're very good movies, not wholly because of how they're subversive at the end, because they do follow the sports formula in a lot of ways, but in execution, there's a lot to the characters that are rich. And in the case of Friday Night Lights, it has that raw rural Texas thing going on, that aesthetic that is so good in that film as you're talking about.
Honestly, if I try and look at sports movies that I think best break away from their respective formulas, or at least like don't really fit into this concept that we're talking about here, I mean, one of the first ones that comes to mind that's a bit of the antithesis here is something like The Sandlot, right? Which I mean, that's a baseball movie where like every sports movie usually ends with the big game or something like that.
Field of Dreams is very different.
Where here are two movies, baseball movies specifically, that don't even really end with any big game, really.
There's no baseball.
It's not
at
even
all,
leading
really.
up to a big game. It's an
Do you wanna
interesting
have
way
a
to buck the
catch?
trend. Oh god.
No, and Sandlot is great too. Like, no, I agree with you. So, no, there are definitely sports movies that do not really qualify with this list. I very much do agree with you there.
Yeah.
Moving on to something completely different, though.
Yep.
And I won't spend a lot of time here because I raved about this last week. But can I say something like Sorcerer fits the bill here? Because when you think about what that movie is about, now we're talking about the thinness of the storytelling.
So now we're not talking about the formula. We're talking about the lack of narrative heft.
Of nothing happens. In Sorcerer, trucks go from here. I have to, there are people listening to this, not just watching us. Mm-hmm. In Sorcerer, you have trucks that go from point A to point B. That's it. That's the entire plot. That's it. But in execution, man, that film was way more than that. It is so good. So, like, again,
that's a great point.
Talking about this film from a different angle, I was like, I think Sorcerer is one of those how it's about movies, because if you were to simply describe that movie on paper, what are you talking about? Like, that doesn't sound appealing. If I went out on the streets and talked to people that knew nothing about this movie, and I said, you got to watch this movie. What's it about? They drive trucks. What? Yeah, they just go from here to there, and they have to go around this turn, and it's kind of harrowing. They go across a bridge at one point, but it is storming. It's a rain.
Like,
what are you talking about? No, I'm not watching that movie. There's nothing about it appealing on paper.
Yeah, but then in order to describe why you have to watch it, all of a sudden now you're getting into the how, right?
Yes, you're getting into the how.
Yeah.
So I think it's a perfect movie that fits the bill here.
You bring up a really great point, because when I'm looking at my list right now, I spent most of my time thinking of movies that sat within a particular formula, because that was more about, with Blue Beetle, for instance, that is a superhero formula through and through, as we're talking about, and that's how it inspired this list. So I was using formulas as my main criteria.
Which is fair.
Here.
That's how we probably think about it most of the time.
But you make a great point that this concept can exist within stories that have very little happening. So thinking of this off the cuff, one of my favorite subgenres of any movie is what I call the quote unquote brief encounter movie. Not just something like Brief Encounter, David Lean's
Brief Encounter, the literal movie,
the literal Brief Encounter, but even something like I guess most specifically something like Before Sunrise. I can't really say the whole trilogy because the what becomes more interesting with the sequels, knowing what preceded it. But if you just try and describe Before Sunrise specifically, it's thin. It's two characters meet in Vienna and hang out.
They talk in a cafe.
Or like My Dinner with Andre. These movies that are just about two people having a conversation. It doesn't sound very interesting when you say it that broadly on paper, but they have very interesting and dare I say, fun ways of getting around that thinness to make it very interesting.
I agree.
And a lot of it comes down to writing and dialogue and great performances.
Absolutely. Or if you want to get really pretentious with it, we could go to the world of Andrei Tarkovsky, in the sense that not all of his movies, but some of
it's
them,
just a bunch of philosophizing.
yeah, where it's just there's not much that's happening. And so in terms of like from a plotting perspective, and let's get down to what this movie is really doing in the what, it's like less than a paragraph.
The thing is, like, so many of his movies have really interesting settings and concepts surrounding them that there is such an interesting what behind it. But
there's still not a lot of it, though.
There isn't a lot of it. You're right. So in some ways, it's almost, at times, it almost functions in both ways, where the what is less interesting than the how, and then at times the how becomes less interesting than the what. It's like
it just depends on the movie.
It just depends on the movie, or like the particular scene or moment of the movie.
For sure.
Tarkovsky, very interesting filmmaker.
Yeah, and I'm sure there's other examples within that realm that I'm losing track of here on the spot, but I very much thought of Sorcerer.
Yeah.
Or another angle that I thought about here is the remake. So two that came to mind immediately for me in that regard, because again, you talk about remakes and the angle of, okay, we've seen this story before.
Yeah.
We know where this is going to go. And yet in execution, it doesn't become about what we know or what to expect going in, but in execution, how it it has its own identity. So two examples for me would be Steven Soderbergh's Solaris.
Okay. Time back to Tarkovsky again. I love it.
Back to Tarkovsky. You walk in going, okay, I've seen the Tarkovsky movie. I know what I'm getting into here. And yet in execution, it's so, in a lot of ways, different from the Tarkovsky version, while being very similar at the same time, that it almost, like, it has its own identity separate from Tarkovsky, despite the story being so familiar. And in execution, I think it is excellent. I've been on record, and maybe this is a little hot takey, but I've been on record of saying I like it just as much, if not even more so.
It's a very different movie. Works almost like a yin and yang of sorts, and kind of fits within this weird bridge between a remake of a movie or a second adaptation of a source material or a novel, and somehow it just weirdly sits in both.
It's a little bit of both in that regard, and that's a fair point. I think that's a fair point. But on the same token, I think it's also fair to say that you hear Steven Soderbergh is going to make a Solaris movie.
Yeah.
Immediately we think, oh, he's doing a remake of Tarkovsky's movie.
Yeah.
In essence, it's a little bit of both with what you're saying, but you might walk in thinking, and at least I did. When I first saw that movie, I watched it with Tarkovsky in mind, thinking this is going to be his remake of that movie. And in a lot of ways, it's so very different. Like, so much of what happens is familiar. Obviously, it follows the source material in that way, but he does it with his own Soderbergh-isms, and he gets one of the best, if not the best, Clooney performance of his career. And it's so deeply inviting with its ideas and that, that fork in the road question that the film provokes.
Yeah.
And what you would choose in that way, which Tarkovsky does as well, but it's in a very different way. So you watch Solaris, and to me, that movie is all about the how it's about and less the what it's about, especially if you've seen Tarkovsky. Or another example I think of is Bradley Cooper's A Star is Born, which is like the 45th adaptation of that story.
Only 45th? Wow.
You know what I mean? And in execution, I think that film is...
It's sincere. Again, it's that word again. And talking about sincerity, I mean, we could talk about many movies that fall in the category of remakes that somehow tell a very traditional story, and it feels earnest and new at the same time. So if we're keeping this theme going, how about David Lowery's Pete's Dragon?
Yes. Thank you. Oh my gosh. That is quintessential Brendan when it comes to this.
It's not even just a remake, but even it takes.
That's almost like Solaris, right? It's more of a different adaptation.
He's basically adapting E.T. over Pete's Dragon.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
but something like that I think can fit the bill as well because it is such a traditional story. Not just comparing it to Pete's Dragon, the original, because it's really nothing like that movie. It's
No.
it's a traditional boy and his dog story. It's what it
Yeah.
is. So, I mean, honestly, many dragon movies can fit the bill. How to Train Your Dragon's a traditional story, and
Wait, I wanted to get to animation because I think animation is another.
I have a
one
couple
of those
examples as
genres.
well. Yeah,
All right. Well, I had How to Train Your Dragon on there as well for obvious reasons.
yeah.
I guess. Did you want to finish remakes or did you just want to head into animation?
Let's head into animation because I feel like we can talk about a lot of them. And to be honest, I'll just jump the gun a little bit. Most of my examples are from Pixar because Pixar is known for a formula now, right? We've talked about this. And when I was talking earlier that we have sometimes acknowledged movies for their formulas and maybe that hindered the movie a little bit, it's because we felt like the other components of those movies were failing to elevate the formula, right? And I think that has happened with Pixar, especially. I think a movie like Soul, for instance, gets bogged down by its formula. And I don't think it has enough to
agree.
overcome that.
I agree.
But to look at the more positive end of the spectrum, I recently rewatched Toy Story 3 the other day. And this is a movie
boy.
I've always loved, okay?
Yeah.
But I loved it so much more on this rewatch because of how much it commits to its formula. And what I mean by that is Toy Story 2, its predecessor, literally tells you exactly what Toy Story 3 is going to be about and what's going to happen. There are no surprises in Toy Story 3. It is blueprinted for you because of Toy Story 2. Yet there is something very powerful about that notion. You know, this idea that when you're young, you're told that things are eventually going to change. This idea that you're going to have to say goodbye to the things or the people you love the most at some point in your life. And as a kid, you kind of get it, but you also don't. And somehow Toy Story 3 takes that familiarity and by simply just running with the inevitability of it and the obviousness of it, it forces you as someone who has now come of age to understand what that actually feels like. And I don't know if that was the intent or not, but there's something about how Toy Story 3 is written. It takes what was set up and just simply runs with it. And it's so powerful because of that. It gets into that really interesting idea that you finally learn what this feels like when you actually experience it. I think for those of us who grew up with Andy, Toy Story 3 was the moment we came of age. So and it feeds into the inevitability and the literal component of that very well.
Yeah. I think it is a great extension of what we saw in the first two Toy Story films, with Toy Story 2 talking a lot about abandonment.
Yeah.
And then 3 gets into this idea of being replaced. And I love how all three of those films, in some way, shape, or form, are almost derivative of each other, but in a way that is so effective and like just compounds on itself in these great ways. I haven't seen the film since 2015, I believe. So I'd be curious to go back and rewatch it through that
It's
specific
really
lens
good.
you're talking
It's
about.
really good. And then I
it is
rewatched
great,
Toy
though. I
Story
love it.
4, and I'm still not in love with it.
I don't love it either. And that's one of those movies that probably fits the bill here for a lot of other people, because to me, that is the most derivative of all of them. And Toy Story 4 for me is thematically and narratively, it is doing the exact same as that first trilogy. There's nothing new to the film. So it really comes down to execution. And for a lot of people, it is effective. And I do like some of the newer elements it proposes, but in totality, it's just not there for me. So that's where I somewhat criticize the film for, again, not what it's about as much as I don't think it's doing anything to distinct itself from the others. So that somewhat lessens it in my mind. But more so than that, even if everything was the same in terms of the what, if it was there in execution, I still probably would have really liked the film. Yeah. But it's just not there for me in execution. That's my biggest issue with it.
I keep wondering what they're going to do with Toy Story 5, especially knowing that apparently both Woody and Buzz will be in it. I don't know. At this point, I'm skeptical. I really am.
Yeah. I can't say that I'm looking forward to it.
Let's get back to the positive end of the spectrum. What other animated movies fit the bill for you, if you had any more on your list?
I do have others written here. I kind of wonder about. I'm curious what you think of the Disney Renaissance era. Because these are movies that are adapted from classic works. And as children, we watch them, and these are the first time that we're being introduced to them in many ways. I don't know about you, but I never saw anything about Hamlet before the age of 9.
Oh,
yeah. I was introduced to The Lion King. So,
absolutely.
But like as adults, I can see how that would change things a little bit because there are so many movies that are adapted from Hamlet, for example, or these classic stories, not just The Lion King.
Well, The Northman, we can throw that in there as well.
The Northman. I mean, as an adult, like I could see how someone could watch The Northman before The Lion King if a Northman existed when The Lion King came out. But yeah, I mean, there's a lot of movies that kind of fit the bill there. And in terms of the formula, maybe less so The Lion King, because that is a film that I think is actually quite bold in its storytelling. But I think there are some, but in a lot of ways, a lot of Disney's animated films do follow a certain formula in terms of, okay, by the end of the film, we have to present it this way. And I understand because they're trying to pander to children. This is, I wasn't going to bring this up in this conversation, but now that we're here, I guess I'll go ahead and, bring it into the discussion.
Okay.
Because I think right now, I guess you could probably label superhero films at large, but specifically Marvel has been a talking point in terms of, we've seen this before.
Yeah.
There's nothing new. I mean, we just mentioned that Blue Beetle is kind of the blueprint for this conversation in many ways. And Blue Beetle follows a lot of the same Marvel formula. And, these movies haven't been successful at the box office as of recent, with a few aside. Yeah. Guardians 3, I think, did pretty well. But a lot of them lately haven't been performing. Is that indicative of people being tired of these movies? And if so, are they being tired because of the formula? Because it's gotten too derivative? Or is it the execution? Because you look at Phase 4 from Marvel, and the talking points, I think, came down to less people being tired or more so people just not liking the films and execution as much.
I think it's more of that, because and you know what will prove this theory for us, or at least will help, is if Blue Beetle ends up being successful in the long run, like we were talking, like we were hoping for in the beginning of this conversation, right? Because now I haven't seen Blue Beetle, so I can't say definitively if I felt like the film was on paper rather derivative, right? I can't say that, but it sounds like most people would agree that that is potentially the case. It's just the familial and cultural dynamic at play that elevates those things, right? Yeah. So if there is word of mouth there, it just proves that people just want to see good movies. It doesn't matter what it's conveying from a narrative standpoint.
I agree. I think a lot of it comes down to that. And we've seen as recent as this year, not just Guardians 3, and Guardians 3, it performed well critically. It did pretty well at the box office as well. But Across the Spider-Verse was a huge sensation.
Yeah.
Big movie. It's another Spider-Man movie. And while, there's so much about that film that is inventive and unique, it really doesn't belong in this conversation. But it is indicative that superhero movies are still an event.
Superhero movies are not the problem.
Superhero movies themselves, I don't think, are the issue. If you want to create a Thor 5, and I have thoughts on that.
Oh, God.
But if you want to do a fifth Thor and you do it well and you make it alluring in a new and invigorating way, I think people will go and watch that movie. They will. Yeah. They absolutely will. And I think part of where Marvel's at right now is they haven't intrigued people with the multiverse like they did with the Infinity Stones. I think it simply comes down to that. And a lot of it is execution.
Yeah.
Phase 4, I liked on the whole, but I'm willing to admit that it was a little uneven at times.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Starting things out with the Black Widow movie that was 5 years past its due date.
Yeah.
As much as I would have liked that movie back in 2016, I don't know if, when that came out in 2019, 19,
Maybe in 20. Was that 2020? Was that
2020? Was it really
I
that
think
late?
I think that
You might be
was
right.
was one of the first pandemic movies, if I'm not mistaken, wasn't it?
I know it was post Endgame. Did Endgame come out in 2019?
Endgame was 2019, I want to say.
So you
Honestly,
might be right. Okay,
I
so
don't even-
it might be
Black Widow
closer
was
to the-
2021.
Really? It was that late, huh?
Yeah.
Wow.
I'm scrolling down at
Time,
IMDb.
it eludes me. It's a flat circle.
This came out in
Okay,
July
well-
of 2021.
Well, there's
Wow.
that. And also the other thing with Marvel and Blue Beetle might be a victim of this as well, is that now we're being introduced to characters that we aren't as familiar with. Everyone knows Spider-Man. They know Captain America, Thor, Superman, Batman. We know those characters, and people show
Right.
up for them.
Right.
Eternals, I've never heard of them. I don't know if I'm going to go see that one. Blue Beetle, I've never heard of it. I'll
Yeah,
wait for that one.
what is this Power Ranger or Big Bad Beetleborg? It's
Yeah, right. I think that's part of where now again this is new on the DC side, so
sure.
we'll maybe give it a little bit more time to see, and again, hopefully Blue Beetle will find its audience because, and again, we forget this because Tony Stark is such a cultural icon now, but in 2008 he was a B-list superhero for Marvel.
Yeah.
He was not the A-lister he is now. So Blue Beetle could find a similar-ish trajectory down the road if the character is utilized in other films and becomes a big part of the Justice League. You assume that he will be in some way, shape, or form going forward. Otherwise, why are they introducing the character?
Sure.
And I really like the character. Hopefully, we see more of Jaime. But my point is, he is generally a character. He's not Batman, right? He's not Superman. He's not Aquaman. Marvel is somewhat in this phase as well with some of their characters that they've introduced in phase 4.
Right.
So that could be a part of it as well. All of that to say, I think there's a debate to be had about whether it's execution or if it's the formula. I don't know.
I think it's easy for people to say it's the formula because that's what they recognize, but I think the fact that there have been successes still utilizing that formula just proves the point that it's just the quality of films or the overabundance of similar content that we can just kind of tell is being corporately mandated as opposed to artistically created, right?
Mm-hmm.
And whether you recognize that that's the specific reason why, people aren't dumb, right? People who go to see these movies, you can tell when there wasn't artistic passion behind the making of it, right? Whether you can verbalize it in that way, I think it's just something you can sense, right? It's almost like a weird form of human nature, right? We react to the compassion and the sincerity. That's just something that we, at least you and I, we can speak for ourselves. We instinctually react to, and I think that's part of it because the ones that haven't been successful have felt like the most obligatory ones. And I think that's part of it. There are certainly a lot of factors here, but that's something I've always felt like was a big talking point with it.
I agree. And while that was a rabbit hole that I wanted to use as somewhat of a comparison, I guess, but to circle it back to animation, I kind of wonder if a similar argument is to be had there because there is a formula to a lot of these movies that you somewhat expect because you're walking into a movie that will ultimately in some way, not all of them, especially if we're looking at something like Studio Ghibli or something like Wolfwalkers even. And everything from that studio. But within the, the Hollywood studio system anyway, a lot of these animated films, they are going to end in a certain way that will pander to children. And you expect that to a degree, and that doesn't lessen these films. I mean, we just talked about Toy Story. Those are excellent movies.
Yeah.
Or How to Train Your Dragon. That's an excellent movie, despite where it all ends. So, like, I do think there is a formula there for a lot of them.
Yeah.
So where does one draw the line with these movies? I think is a fascinating question.
I think it is a very fascinating question. I would love to just get a bunch of people in a room and have this conversation, see what those perspectives are, because I think it'll be pretty different, especially if you are able to balance those perspectives out with people who really work in the business, kind of live in the business, and those who are just simply casual moviegoers, and to see what their perspectives are.
Did you have any specific films aside from Toy Story 3 on your list within animation?
As far as animation, not really. I wanted to highlight Toy Story 3 because I just rewatched that again the other day. And like I said, there are a lot of films within Pixar's filmography that I think fit this bill, because if you really describe their movies in a very superficial and high level way, a lot of them have very similar story beats as far as not really plot points, but more like tropes, right? You tend to have a main character paired with some other character that they're very different from each other. They go on some adventure together and they learn how to coexist, right? That's there's always some element of that. Like the odd couple pairing is apparent in almost all of Pixar's films, right? But the best ones take those tropes and do something really interesting with them, such as Inside Out. Or
absolutely.
Yeah, or like I mentioned, Toy Story is another great example. Coco is a movie I want to watch again, because when we first saw that, I felt like I was recognizing the formula a little too much in that film, that I felt like there wasn't enough going on behind it to really kind of, mitigate the formula. But I want to watch that one again because I know it has a cultural following, to say the least.
Yeah, I love the cultural aspects of Coco. Again, the what it's about is fascinating in that film. Like I love the what it's about there. Really, where that film slightly fizzles for me, again, comes to execution, specifically within the writing. I think some of the narrative beats are a little contrived for me.
The third act villain stuff that comes about, I think, is really unfortunate.
I don't love all of that stuff, but on the whole, I think there's a lot to really love about that movie. And, the characters are really great. The emotion that comes about is just fantastic. So, yeah, I mean, there's just a few hiccups here and there that, again, come down to an execution thing. But the what of Coco, I just absolutely I love.
And I was almost tempted to bring up some of Pixar's more recent films, but I feel like some of these movies, like let's say Luca or even Turning Red, these are the ones that I feel like are slowly kind of breaking away from that formula. They have more interesting ideas in the quote unquote what, as opposed to just the how. I mean, Luca is basically a hangout movie when you think about it. And that's very different for Pixar. So I can't really cite those as examples, but yeah, up until that point, I think Pixar kind of had a bit of a familiar formula that they were working with. And the best ones find ways to buck that. I also think of Pete Docter's Up from 2009.
Yeah, sure.
I know some people find that movie to be a bit of a, I don't want to say letdown, but they feel like it peaks so high with its first 10 minutes and doesn't really sustain itself. I'm not one of those who agree with that. I think the movie
I don't either.
I actually think the movie peaks at the 80-minute mark. So
fair.
Yeah.
I mean, I do love that opening, but I don't think it's momentum stifling after that opening. I don't agree with that criticism either.
Yeah.
I will say this, though, with this conversation. I think that's why 2014 will always, unless something comes along another year, 2014 will always be the best year for animation in my mind.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
Given at least US releases. I do want to throw that caveat there because it is a little bit more jagged depending on when these films came out in these various countries. But in the United States, the movies we got for animation that year was The Wind Rises, How to Train Your Dragon 2, The Tale of the Princess Kaguya, The Lego Movie, and Song of the Sea. There will never be another 5 better than that for me.
It's a great
all
run.
of those movies,
great run.
In all 5 of those movies in any other year, except for maybe Inside Out, because that to me is also elite, would be the best animated film for so many other years. Like all 5 of them are on such a different level and are inventive and invigorating all in their own way. How to Train Your Dragon 2 is the closest of them that comes to the formula, but it also has its own bold choices that are in that Lion King-esque territory where I think that film is subversive enough that it really doesn't qualify for this conversation.
I agree.
And so I look at those 5 and I go, that is unreal that we got all 5. Like this year might come the closest.
Yeah.
I think this has been a pretty good year for animation. It might come
So far. Yeah.
So far. I don't know if it'll quite reach that height, but 2014 will always stand out for me in that regard.
Yeah. No, I'll bring up one more film in animation to at least close out this component of this conversation. But you have another one behind you that I think kind of fits the bill. Guillermo del Toro's Pinocchio, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a traditional story. Now he does some interesting things with it, at least in the 3rd act, but there's a lot there's a lot that it's doing, for at least its first 2/3 that are pretty traditional, pretty familiar. So that one also kind of fits the bill a little bit too, and that's a wildly devastating movie.
I agree. I completely agree. I didn't even think of that, and it's right there, so I should be ashamed.
You're welcome.
I do love that. Brendan, it's our favorite coffee. Yeah.
I found some great coffee in the mail just the other day.
Yes. How did you enjoy said coffee?
You're killing me, man, because I don't like drinking coffee at night, but it's like dessert for me. It's a great.
It's good,
it just
right?
tastes great to have at the end of the day.
Yeah, it's really good. Specifically, what Brendan is talking about is some brand new, freshly roasted Colombian IPE from Coffee Cult.
Yeah.
It's great. I've been talking about it for weeks. I'm glad you were able to try it. It's like drinking dessert. It tastes so good.
Yeah.
It's incredible. Has these notes of like peach and strawberry to them. I mean, it's really terrific. Again, it's one of those coffees that, because we're talking about specialty grade coffee, you don't have to throw in milk and sugar into this. It already is sweet. In fact,
it's the natural sweetness. Yeah. Especially for someone like me that doesn't have much of a sweet tooth. Like this is like the perfect way to satisfy me like that.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm with you wholly. And, I understand that some people like to put in some milk and sugar with their coffee, but this coffee is so exquisite that you actually ruin those notes by throwing in milk and sugar.
Yeah.
And
one thing I noticed about it too is that, I guess for a little context, the only time I ever put any type of like milk product or like whether it be half and half or a light cream or something, it's not really for taste. It's maybe just to add a little bit of literal body to it, like to give it like a certain like a thickness or a density to it. But this coffee that you sent already has that kind of embedded into it, right? Like it already has that body that I'm looking for, that it doesn't even need anything added to it.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Yeah, it's freshly roasted coffee. So like Coffee Cult doesn't have coffee just sitting around in a warehouse. Like they wait for you to order, it comes through the system, and then it's roasted and sent out to you in just a few days. So it's extremely fresh. And again, it's specialty grade. They inspect every single bean that comes through, so you're not getting, anything cheap, nothing that will degrade the quality of the coffee.
Right.
And it's all, pretty cost effective for specialty grade coffee.
Yep.
They, only work with farms that pay its workers, especially women, fairly and equally.
Yeah.
That's a big thing for them as well. It's just the best coffee you'll ever have. It's fantastic. So go to coffeecult.com. That's coffee with a K, cult with a K, coffeecult.com. Use the code ISF. Again, that code is ISF, and you'll get 15% off. So coffeecult.com. Use the code ISF. Let's talk about podcasting. I know you know it.
We're on one. We're doing one right now.
We're doing one.
Yeah.
A little meta here.
And yeah, podcasting's fun, but it's not easy. It's hard
It's
to
not
maintain
easy.
a podcast, right? Sometimes you need a great host. You need, and not just, not talking about you, JD.
Yeah,
I'm talking
you
about a
need me.
literal host. I'm talking
Every
about
podcast needs me. That's what we're
every
talking about.
every
here.
podcast needs a JD. Yeah, you're absolutely right. But I'm talking about a literal host. This one being Libsyn, who has been basically the home for InSession Film ever since it started. Now a decade ago, we
Yeah.
haven't lose sight of them. They've been so helpful over these past 10 years.
Yeah, they've been extremely helpful getting the podcast set up, getting all of the various links needed to Apple and the Spotify and all of the various places that podcasts need to go to. That's what they do. They help you get set up. They host over 75,000 podcasts worldwide.
Yep.
They're a combination of liberated and syndicated. So these guys, they know what they're doing. They've been in this business for a long time. And right now, if you want to start your own podcast and you want Libsyn to host it for you, go to libsyn.com, use the promo code ISF, and you'll get 2 months free. 2 months
You'll love
free.
it. Trust us, everyone. It's not just the convenience of what Libsyn is able to provide when it comes to hosting your podcast, providing the proper links and setup with regard to streaming platforms, whatever that is. It's the metrics that you're able to get from it. Because the best way to grow a podcast is knowing what's working and what's not. And Libsyn provides that insight for you, and in such an easy way.
Absolutely. You get all the stats you need. If anything happens, their customer support staff is really fantastic as well. They're willing to help you at any time with whatever your issue is. It's really great. We've had no problems with them, and we've been using them for since the beginning, as Brendan mentioned. So really fantastic. Go to libsyn.com. That's LIBSYN. LIBSYN, libsyn.com. Use the code ISF and get your first 2 months of podcasting for free. Transitioning to a few others here that I wanted to talk about. And I'm going to lose some people here, I think.
Oh, I have one that I'm going to say that I think I'll lose a lot of people, but you go ahead.
Okay. But hear me out, because again, I love this movie. I think it is great. But let's talk about that original Die Hard. I think from a storytelling perspective, there's not really anything to it that is all that inventive. We have a villain. He takes over this building, and there's a cop trying to take them all down. It's very simple. It's almost sorcerer-esque. It's so simple.
Actually, that's a great point.
You know what I mean? And also, it's the traditional good versus evil. You have the cop doing, he has his convictions to be a cop. He's going to take down the bad guy. But what separates Die Hard is its execution. It's how John McClane goes about taking out these guys. It's one of the best villains we've ever seen in a movie. The
Rest in
dialogue,
peace.
the dynamic. Yeah, absolutely. Rest in peace. The performances, all of it is incredible, even if at times, and again, not just action tropes, but if we want to talk about John McClane as a superhero, he does things in this film that he would not have survived otherwise. Like there's a moment where he jumps from the top of an elevator shaft, catches this vent, like misses the one he's going for, and lands like at a level below.
It's saying something how visceral and severely felt that movie is from a filmmaking standpoint when you think of all of those things that John McClane had to go through. Now, first off, change of subject. I don't know if you noticed, but my light is flickering behind me. So apparently this conversation is getting really interesting that the spirits are now getting involved. I think Alan Rickman, rest in peace, heard us talking about him. If my power goes out, that's why. So I just want to make that clear for everyone listening, thinking, what the heck's going on in his background? But anyway, back to Die Hard. You know the movie's working, and you know that it's effective when out of all of those things and these obstacles that John McClane has to go through, the one you remember is when he has to simply walk on glass.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like that means the movie's working.
Yeah, absolutely. So I just think from an action perspective, from a formula perspective, I do think there are a lot of familiar beats to it, but I kind of love its simplicity. Like it's really nothing more than We have a cop that just happens to be in the right place at the right time, and he's the one that can potentially bring these guys to justice.
Yeah.
And how he goes about doing that is very clever. It's obviously a lot of fun. Again, the banter and dialogue between the characters is really rich. You know, it's all about taking what is a simple idea, arguably a formulaic idea, and making it arguably the best action film of all time.
What
And
it's
that's,
doing, yeah.
That's where the argument lies with Die Hard. No one talks about that film going, yeah, that should have won Oscars for writing. No, nobody cares about the writing.
That is when you're able to take, when I say you, I mean the filmmakers, the actors, everyone involved in the making of this film. It's when they're able to take simplicity and turn it into efficiency, right?
Yes.
Because that film is so efficient in what it's doing.
Absolutely. And I just find it funny in retrospect. It's, while it follows the action tropes of the 80s in a lot of ways, it also follows a lot of superhero tropes of today.
Kind of, yeah.
And you know, this is the most, I use this extremely loosely, but it's the most grounded we ever see John McClane. I will also give the film credit for that. And
I thought A Good Day to Die Hard was like a documentary.
yeah, of course, when they nearly die from explosions.
We talked about reviewing that on the podcast at some point, didn't we?
I would love to. No, I really like Die Hard 3 quite a lot. But you know,
Die Hard 3? I was talking about Die Hard 5.
Oh no, Die Hard 5? Oh god.
Yeah.
No.
Yeah, that because
you know what? I take that back. I would love to revisit that film just for nostalgic's sake.
yeah. You
know, being the first review we ever did here on the show, a little first time watcher style, if you will.
Yeah, more or less.
At any rate, like I feel like this film very much falls into this category. It's where it's in execution where it thrives.
Well, let's keep that theme going and keep the I get not even just the action film theme going, but those that I think overcome their narrative simplicity and give us something really thrilling and interesting and efficient. And I don't know if I'll lose people here, but Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Oh boy, okay.
Like on the page, that's basically what that movie is inspired by, right? These classic serials of the 1940s, 1950s, like that whole era of classic television serials. That is exactly what that movie is, drawing from some type of cultural history or religiosity. It's on the page, that movie is really not doing anything overly inventive, but I mean, I don't know if you know this, Spielberg is a very good action director. So he's able to imbue that film with not just one of the most charming central heroes of all time, but some of the most inventive action sequences of the 1980s. Some of the best character dynamics, some of the most threatening villains. And he's taking the Nazis into this whole thing. It's not the most inventive of ideas, but it becomes one of the most inventive movies in execution. So I feel like that's another one that kind of falls into that same spectrum.
I agree, because I feel like when we talk about Indiana Jones, we don't really ever talk about how or maybe I should rephrase what I'm saying there, because the how is exactly what we talk about. But we don't talk about him finding these artifacts and the significance of that in a vacuum. Because it doesn't matter what artifact he's after. Yeah. It's how he gets there, for one.
It's a MacGuffin movie. But
it's a MacGuffin movie. Yeah, exactly. Because it's how he gets there, and then he finds the artifact, and then the artifact creates chaos.
Yep.
That's what happens.
Yeah.
And that's what makes those films so captivating. So I think you make a great point there.
Yeah. And I feel like all of them fall into that camp. I'm only singling out Raiders of the Lost Ark because it was the first and the one that was most directly linked to those classic serials that inspired them in the first place.
Yeah, I didn't really think about Raiders, but I think you make such a great argument that as we're talking here, another one that comes to mind, and I'll keep this brief because we actually just talked about this a few weeks ago, The Curse of the Black Pearl.
Yeah.
And you know, I bring that up to say, I think there's an argument where that film is a little murky because they're basing this off of really nothing. It's based off this ride that has some visuals to it and nothing else. So they have to create a lot of this story from nothing. But they do utilize a lot of pirate lore that is familiar. And if nothing else, the reason I think of it here is its sequels, particularly like the fourth and fifth one. Like there's a version of The Curse of the Black Pearl that is really bad. And we've seen that this franchise can be that. Even with its pirate lore and everything that's so alluring about it, if the writing isn't there and the execution isn't there, the latter two Pirates movies are exemplify that The Curse of the Black Pearl could have been really bad.
Yeah.
There's a possibility where it came out just like those movies did, but instead, its execution was anything but that, and we have one of the best films of that year as a result. Not just a great movie of that kind, but one of the best movies of 2003.
that I completely agree. When we did that 2003 retrospective, that made both of our top 10 lists.
Absolutely,
it's that good. That movie is that good. Like,
I agree. I agree,
and I think it only gets better with time.
I completely agree. So that's one that I think in execution way trumps whatever's there on the page.
Maybe even if we keep to the idea of action franchises, maybe the Mad Max films kind of fit that bill a little bit too. And again, that kind of almost fits two bills, right? It's not just the regurgitation of post-apocalyptic storytelling, but it's also the simplicity of those movies that we don't really get any backstory. And sometimes in the case of something like Fury Road, the movie is just a chase scene. It's just getting people from one location to another. It's a very thin narrative.
A big chase scene. And that's kind of that sorcerer thing, right? Of an execution, there's so much more there.
Yeah.
If anything, the difference for me between the two is I do think from a writing perspective, Fury Road has some wonderful poetry to it.
You're right.
Really
there's
great.
good dialogue there. And
the themes are so rich and
and while the movies are inventive visually, just given the world building of them all, there's a lot about it that had to have been, I guess, determined on the page in some way, whether it be in the script or the storyboarding process.
Yes, for sure.
So I think while it does kind of fit the bill, you could definitely sense that there is an essence of more thought going into play within the actual storytelling there.
I don't think you're too off base, though, in the sense that Fury Road thrives on not just its action sequences and George Miller's direction, but specifically, and not just his direction in terms of the bombacity of the film and the visuals of it, the cinematography, but again, thinking about its themes, there's the performances that are really great, and then I think of visual cues such as the moment where Tom Hardy has to dump the milk on him.
Oh,
and you see Max, cover himself in milk and what that means symbolically for that's such a rich, nuanced visual that is all about its its execution. And a lot of the film is obviously that way too. So I don't think you're too far off, even if there's more writing there than something like Sorcerer. But again, that film was never going to win an Oscar for writing.
No. And neither was Titanic. I mean, in some ways, I'm thinking about movies Titanic that were nominated for Best Picture and Best Director, but didn't really get the Best Screenplay nomination. And I just happened to throw Titanic in there as another example. And I threw that in there because I kind of wanted to highlight maybe a few that fall into the category of true stories or biopics.
Yeah.
Because biopics, especially
Oppenheimer.
Well, it's okay. Well, I mean that one has such a tricky screenplay. You can't say that. I'm talking about movies that.
Just kidding.
I'm talking about movies that still have the essence of what we call Wikipedia style storytelling.
Yes,
and yet somehow they are still effective, right? Like we talked about Martin Scorsese's The Aviator in that way. I know it's not one of your favorite Scorsese. Well, I know it's not one of your favorite Scorsese films. It wouldn't be in my top 10 or anything, but that script is just a series of bullet points, and yet that movie at least feels kind of alive, right?
The direction is great. Now, Marty comes to play in The Aviator. I do not like its scripting at all.
Right.
Its Wikipedia style, I think, is a big problem with that film. But I will not disagree that Marty comes ready. to
Yeah.
play,
Yeah.
and he has a great time. And the performances, I think, are very good. So,
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm mixed on it, but I can see where you're coming from though.
Yeah.
With that, and obviously there's a lot of people that feel like Marty is able to overcome its scripting problems.
And maybe better examples of this are more in the vein of music biopics, because I feel like that criticism of Wikipedia style storytelling is
goodness.
more representative in the music biopic subgenre. But I think ones that actually do it fairly well are maybe something like Rocket Man, for instance.
Wild Rose, that's one that comes
Wild
to mind for
Rose.
me.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
That's it for me.
Love and
Yeah.
Mercy.
Love and
but
Mercy. Oh my god!
Again,
yes.
Love and Mercy, it has a tricky framing device. So in a way, it maybe overcomes that a little bit. But I mean, still, the bones of that movie from a scripting standpoint is the writing of pet sounds, just juxtaposed by an older Brian Wilson and his psychosis. So,
but it's the tortured genius thing, which
that's true.
Again, isn't anything new. So I think that movie absolutely fits the bill here.
There you go. Okay, it's a great point.
Maybe not in
Thematically
terms
speaking.
of the like Wild Rose and Love and Mercy. Funny enough, are two music movies, but they like the formulas they follow are actually kind of different. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But I think they both fit absolutely in execution. They're both terrific.
And earlier, before we started recording this episode, we were briefly talking about Oliver Stone, the Doors.
The Doors, absolutely.
Yeah, that is a Wikipedia style movie through and through, and yet it is somehow very visceral and effective. It just has such like a foggy haze, this drug-fueled haze to it, fitting the time of the 1960s and in the 1970s that fueled their music, the Doors specifically. I mean, but the narrative isn't really anything above formulaic, right? It very much is that.
I think another genre that we could talk about here, you certainly probably have more insight into this, but I also think of the slasher genre, particularly of maybe the 70s and 80s and early 90s. Like there's a reason that Scream exists.
Yeah.
And the reason it exists is because the formula was so prominent that it was like, we're going to make fun of it the whole time while embracing it at the same time.
The irony of it is that Scream came out at the right time because it's rightfully criticizing that formula. Most of those films that it's criticizing, I don't think are very good, if I'm being honest. I mean, okay, like A Nightmare on Elm Street. The first one's great. First one's amazing. But then you look at the Friday the 13th series. I mean, you can kind of argue that none of them are really that good.
Well, and that's the thing with, I think, this talking point is, we somewhat talked about this with Marvel. Like I've enjoyed it more than others, but I think a lot of people are experiencing Marvel the same way people were experiencing slashers in the mid-90s, where it's like, oh, we're tired of the same old thing. A lot of these are bad. We need something new and fresh. And maybe what superheroes need more than anything is a Scream version of Marvel now, And so,
what would we call that? Screaming Banshee or something?
Yeah, who knows? I know. But there's a reason that it got to that point where, like, because Scream is as it embraces those tropes and it becomes a horror movie that is felt at times. It's equally just as biting comedically, and that humor comes through in these tropes that are so familiar we can't help but laugh at them.
Yeah.
But that's not indicative of quality. Like when it comes to a movie like that, I don't think it's necessarily making fun of those tropes because the movies were good.
No.
But there's a conversation to be had to what we're talking about here, where, okay, of those movies that fall under that formula for, the 2 decades before, which ones do stand out? Like Candyman for me, I think is one of those. Like the first one, I think is actually pretty good, even though, yes, it embraces a lot of those familiar tropes of the 90s. There's no doubt about it. But I think it is really quite engrossing comparatively to a lot of others of that time.
Yep. And trying to think of other genres that potentially fit the bill. Like we're talking about horror movies now that certainly did at one point, maybe even at one point, romantic comedies.
Rom-coms is another one.
Rom-coms
for sure.
very much did. I acknowledge
the first reconnaissance.
I was just going to say, I acknowledge How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days is not a good movie, and yet I enjoy the hell out of it. But again, it's like, like each of these respective genres have certain things that they're able to utilize that can elevate those tropes, right? And in the case of these romantic comedies of this era, the first reconnaissance, if you will, as you're saying, it came down to the chemistry of the two leads. And in that movie in particular, I think Matthew McConaughey and Kate Hudson have great chemistry. So I'm able to enjoy that movie. I also think of, like some of those Adam Sandler comedies, right? I think he has great chemistry with Drew Barrymore. So as much as I don't think 50 First Dates is a good movie, I actually kind of like it because there is something kind of touching about their relationship. Like they're able to get away with it in some ways like that.
About Time.
I knew you were going to bring that up. That's a good movie. That's a good movie.
It does follow the rom-com thing a little bit, but obviously it's also this sci-fi movie. It's this father-son movie simultaneously. Like, to me, it absolutely overcomes its tropes by being so unique and distinctive. But that's one that comes to mind for sure. Yeah.
Keeping back to, I guess, romantic comedy specifically, I feel like it wasn't really until Judd Apatow came along that sort of upended the formula a little bit or added a new level of raunch to it that we haven't quite seen before. But up until that point, whether it be a straight up romance, like with About Time, despite some of its more fantastical leanings, or the rom-com specific genre, there was definitely repetition there. There really was.
For sure.
Yeah.
No, absolutely. I mean, a lot of genres, I think, fall victim to this.
They do. Yeah.
And there will be those in the middle of it all that stand apart for one reason or another. That's
absolutely.
Sure. The last one I want to throw out here, and then we can move on to the end of the show here.
Okay.
The James Bond franchise. Because there's certainly a formula to a lot of these movies, for better or worse. And not all of them are great. Not all of them are great.
In fact, most of them are not very good, but I don't know. I weirdly find this franchise a lot of fun.
It's a lot of fun. I agree. I enjoy it. I do enjoy it. So anyway, that was just one that came to mind as well.
I think it's a good example.
Before we get to the end of the show, little rant here before we end the show.
We're back to superhero movies once again.
We're back to superhero movies. Because look, it was announced, reported, however you want to label it, that Taika Waititi is preparing for Thor 5. He has some ideas, Brendan. Some ideas.
I don't care.
I hope the idea he has is to hand off the character to someone else, because I think I'm done with Taika Waititi and Thor. I haven't particularly loved his movies. I know a lot of people really liked Ragnarok. And I liked it. I did not love it to the degree that a lot of other people do.
That is the one Marvel movie. I mean, not the one, but I think the one that is most emblematic of what I'm about to say here. I like that one so much less as time goes on.
Yeah, I do not love. I think there's elements that are still very good. Sure. I love the introduction of Korg. We can keep Korg. That's fine. He can stay on as Korg.
I think Taika Waititi made these movies because he simply wanted to be in one. That's what it feels like.
That's what it was. And look, I understand the energy he brings to these movies. And given where Thor was at the time, Ragnarok reinvigorated the character for Chris Hemsworth, which he's stated several times that's what he needed for that character. I think the irony in that is what the character becomes in Infinity War and Endgame, which is not the Taika Waititi aesthetic or that energy. Right. And I think that Thor, and it is not close for me. Let me be crystal clear on this, and some of you may disagree. That's perfectly fine. But for me, it is not even close. Thor is the best character in Infinity War and Endgame. His arc
I'm kind of with you on there.
Incredible. It is so good. I love how emotionally enthralling it is, but also very funny and biting. That balance, I think, is honestly a miracle. I don't know how he pulled it off. It's Hemsworth being at his very best, but some of the best I think about the best moments of those two films. And when you say the word Infinity War, when you say the word Endgame, the first things that come to mind for me are when Thor has this emotional breakdown with Rocket and Infinity War.
Mhm,
And then when he lands in Wakanda with that hammer, oh my God.
Yeah,
Or in Endgame when he has to talk to his mother, and how emotional and funny that is at the same time.
Yeah, great balance.
Like it's incredible the arc that he goes through. And also I think Kenneth Branagh's original Thor film is severely underrated.
Well,
I think it is. I think it's the best individual Thor film.
I saw this on Twitter. I think it was our friend Griffin Schiller who said
Griff was talking about it. Yeah,
yeah, he said who should direct Thor 5? It just had a picture of Kenneth Branagh.
yeah, I agree with them.
That'll get me excited because I'm with you. That is
agree.
This might
He's
be
not wrong.
this might be hot takey. I hate that it sounds this way, but it's just how I feel. My ranking of the 4 Thor movies is release order.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. Wholeheartedly, I'm with you.
I think I don't love the Dark World, but I don't think it's that bad.
I think I like it better than the Waititi films for sure.
I
At the
definitely
very
do,
least,
yeah.
Ragnarok and the Dark World are probably tied for me at worst.
Yeah,
But
I think Ragnarok has more. It has better highs, but also way worse lows for me.
yeah, and that's very fair. And look, there's stuff in the Dark World that I actually do like. Like again, the stuff with his mother, I think is great, especially because of how the MCU uses it later on. And I actually really like Brian Tyler's score. And that's another thing with the first Thor film. Not only is Branagh's Shakespearean background really appropriate for that film, and it comes
I
through
agree.
vividly, but Patrick Doyle's score is incredibly, severely,
it's great.
criminally
It's great.
underrated.
Yeah.
It is so good. And I think the performances are great. Like there's a reason we came to love Loki. It's established early on, and even Hemsworth I think is very good in that movie. So yeah, I really like the best iteration of Thor we've seen have been in the hands of Branagh, and then in Infinity War and Endgame. It has not been with Taika Waititi.
Right.
And Waititi's films have been fun at times, but they've been mostly hollow.
Yeah.
And I'm ready to move on to Kenneth Branagh coming back, as Griffin was talking
Yeah.
about.
Yeah. Yeah.
Or whoever. But I want to see that. I want to see the Infinity War Endgame Thor come back. Like that's the character I want to see. And look, there was someone on our Facebook group page that was arguing like they should have just ended the character after Endgame. And I don't disagree necessarily with that, especially with Cap leaving and Iron Man obviously being gone. If you wanted to end Thor there, that's fine. He does have a rich history in the comics that they clearly wanted to do more of because they were going to get more cosmic with this next phase of Marvel. And so I understand why they wanted to keep him.
Yeah.
And I just don't think Taika's the guy.
I think he's exhausted his efforts, or at least exhausted my interest in his efforts with the MCU.
I agree.
Unless Korg is there.
Yeah, Korg can stay.
Korg
I
can
love
stay.
Korg.
Yeah.
Love Korg. He can stay. That's perfectly fine. But I'm done with Taika. And I want him to go back.
And I say this as someone that's actually kind of interested in his new film, Next Goal Wins, coming out this year.
I was gonna say like I'm really interested in that. I want Taika to do like his smaller work again. Like
I want to see Hunt for the Willow People.
Exactly. Yeah. I want to see that Taika again. Like when he's working in that realm, fantastic. Absolutely terrific. Just haven't loved this Marvel stuff. But I love Thor. Like he's actually become one of my very favorite characters in the MCU.
Sure.
And Hemsworth is committed to the role. Like I love his performance as Thor too. So it's disappointing when this is the direction we're heading with the character. At any rate, that's my rant. Thanks for listening, everybody.
Oh, yeah. I'm with you on that rant, man. I'm with you.
Okay. Well, as we wind down the show here, first of all, thank you to our lovely patrons.
Yeah.
Cannot do this without you. Your support goes a long way. If you want to become a patron, you can sign up at patreon.com/InSession Film. You can sign up for as low as $1 a month. There's other tiers there. And we try to have Patreon exclusive content every week. We recorded one before this show. It was the longest one we've done yet. And it was a great time. Definitely go and check that out. I talk about how I had a rough night leading up to this recording. So
I mean,
you
did. It wasn't just you. It was a 5-month-old that had a rough night too.
Yeah, that's also true. So you can hear that. We talk a little Oliver Stone. Oh boy, that was a fun conversation. Yeah. So you can check that out. Again, that's patreon.com/InSessionFilm. Thank you to our patrons. I mentioned earlier we have a podcast review with Rosa Parra where we talk about Blue Beetle. Brendan, when are you going to see Blue Beetle soon?
I'm going to see it at some point if I can find the time. It really depends on what we decide to do for our own review schedule here, or if I decide, to see Oppenheimer in 70 millimeter. I think at this point I'm going to try and prioritize Blue Beetle because, given those box office numbers, I'm kind of hoping the film succeeds. So I'll go see it just for that reason.
I definitely want to get your thoughts for sure, and kind of see where you land there. But
okay.
I'm definitely wanting the film to succeed. So if nothing else, we'll get Brendan's $12 added to the list.
Hey, it's like casting a vote, right? You might think it might not count, but maybe it does.
Exactly. All the votes matter. Absolutely. But definitely go check out that conversation. Rosa was terrific. We've been meaning to have her on the show for a long time.
I know, and I'm sad that I wasn't there for it.
I know. Unfortunate timing there, but it was great to get her on the show, and you'll love her enthusiasm talking about that movie.
It was so great.
It
was so infectious. It really was.
It's great. So definitely go and check that out. We also have a review for this little film called Theater Camp, and I was joined by David Rosen of the Piecing It Together podcast for that. Definitely go and check that out. We had a great time talking about Theater Camp, one of my favorite supporting performances of the year. That's another one you haven't seen, right, Brandon?
That's another one. Dude, I'm in wedding planning mode.
I know, you're busy. Look, I get it. I'm not, this isn't an indictment.
And not only that, like
Brendan.
for our listeners out there and for our watchers out there, for a little bit of context, yes, I'm getting married in just under 2 months from now. So not only is it crunch time, but I'm also in 2 other weddings this year.
Yeah. Wow.
Leading up to it. So one of those weddings is not this coming Saturday, but next Saturday, the weekend of Labor Day. And then my best man is getting married on my birthday in Indiana. So I got to travel for that.
Crazy.
Yeah. What I don't even like the way when next year comes around, when I get back from my honeymoon, I don't know what life is going to be like. I'm going to feel like, why am I not busy? Like what's going on here?
I know. We're going to get a new Brendan next year.
Oh, yeah. And then I'm going to become a dad. So then
that'll be very exciting. Absolutely. But yeah, we had a great time talking about Theater Camp. I'll definitely be curious to hear your thoughts on that one as well, Brendan. So go check those out. Our latest Women in Session is out right now as well. Zeta and Kristen talk about their favorite 2000s movies. It was a really fun conversation. Obviously, be sure to follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Does Google Plus still exist? I don't think it does. YouTube.
Oh, that is a great question.
I don't think it does. I think it actually was. I think they erased it like almost a decade ago at this time. I think it's been that long, like 2015 maybe. But yeah,
I seriously don't know. That's a great question.
Hey, remember that? Man, that's a trip down memory lane. But yeah, follow us on all the social medias. Follow us on YouTube. Subscribe to the channel, all that sort of jazz. Am I missing anything, Brendan? Any final thoughts before we get out of here?
I guess 2 final thoughts. First off, I can't recall if you even mentioned this in that ending plug, so forgive me if I wasn't listening for just that one particular moment, but loved your interview with John Powell.
Oh, yes. Please go listen to my interview with John Powell. Oh, it was a great time.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. That was really great stuff. Loved his loved his how eloquent that man was. I just loved hearing him talk about music. I thought that was a great conversation that you had. But as far as final thoughts from me, I will just say I'm proud of us, JD, given our deteriorating voices, how much we got through not only this show, but it almost sounds like our voices got better as the conversation went, which just goes to show how passionate we were about this topic.
Yeah. I mean, and that's the thing. Like, I feel good.
Yeah.
Like, my energy level is still high. It just sounds like I'm deteriorating. But if anything, I feel great. But who knows? Maybe I'll kill over at any moment.
No, don't do that. Yeah, it takes a long time to break in a new co-host.
It does. That is true. At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Yeah, I definitely forgot about that. I shouldn't have forgot. John Powell, one of my favorite composers, working today, and I got a chance to talk to him. It was really great.
Yeah.
Did you like my sly? I have to throw in a little jab here at How to Train Your Dragon in the middle of that conversation.
Yeah, but thankfully you have that universal background behind you, so the in was always there, whether it was planned or not.
John, if you're listening to this, I wasn't lying. It's there every week. It's not like that's just there for the interview. I promise you. It's there all the time. So like, I had to throw in a little forbidden friendship love because.
Of course you did. Yeah. Well, hey, it's worth it.
Fave.
It's worth it.
It was. Look, I might not ever get a chance to talk to him again. I had to take my opportunity.
Yeah,
you know
I don't blame you. I don't blame you, dude.
Eminem style. I had to take my shot.
Or otherwise you lose yourself.
Or I lose myself. Exactly. At any rate, thanks for listening, everybody. Thanks for watching. We will see you next time on the InSession Film Podcast. Oh my God, Warrior is so good. What a good movie.
Oh, it's all about the how.